Hi y'all. So today we will be giving an elective and a lecture on stupid theory, on theory arguments, bad theory arguments, and how to best answer them. So this is a play on an article known as "Stupid Counterplans Are Stupid," and instead it's about theory. So theory debate has proliferated in Lincoln Douglas debate. It is an incredibly strategic form of debate because there's a new younger generation of judges who are willing to evaluate theory arguments and who are willing, for example, to listen to debaters who are winning things such as competing interpretations, rejecting the team, for example, and no RVIs. And its strategic incentives from theory comes from its unpredictable and often arbitrary nature. But versus debaters who understand how to indict such unpredictable and arbitrary shells, such shells should almost always lose. So this lecture is going to go over some in-depth analysis on about theory as a practice within debate, some bad arguments against theory and why we should not be making those arguments when we can instead be making better arguments, and then the most optimal strategy versus these theory arguments, especially when you are negating. Though we will also cover what to do when you're affirming as well against one and C theory. So, some things I want to talk about first. So, there are some bad arguments versus theory. The first is no one AR theory. A lot of people in the 1 and C nowadays throw no one AR theory into the block, throw no one AR theory into the block in their 1 and C theory hedges. And the reason why this is a bad argument isn't because like the 1 AR is correct that quote unquote infinite abuse would happen if like the 1 AR wasn't allowed to be theory. It's just that like the warrants for like rejecting 1 AR theory are kind of bad. The warrants boil down to essentially. Wait, did my screen just stop share? Wait, sorry, hold up. There we go. So the arguments against no one ER3 are essentially just boil down to that it's hard to answer them because in the two and R because the two ER can just line by line the two and R. But then this is something that's just non-unique in general, and that the one ER can just, for example, read new arguments anyways. They can straight turn disads, for example. They can read new add-ons. They can straight turn counterplans, etc. They can read, for example, new impact turns in the one ER, and the two and R has to answer them, and the two ER gets line by line them anyways. So there's no unique reason why specifically one ER theory is something that is bad compared to like a litany of other things that the one ER could do that quote unquote time press the 2R, which means that like secluding theory as an argument that the 1R is not allowed to read is something that is inherently arbitrary and something that AF teams are getting really, really good at focusing on nowadays. The next segment I think that is pretty bad against theory is reasonability is good enough. So I will say that like this lecture will talk about reasonability and how we can effectively go for reasonability. But the way that most debaters seem to understand how to go for reasonability nowadays as good enough seems to fundamentally misunderstand first what reasonability actually says, but secondly also bites into a lot of disadvantages to the into like for example the model of like reasonability in debates. By the way, if I'm going too fast in any point in the lecture, or like you have any questions about in the lecture, feel free to just interrupt me at any point because I will not be checking the chat at any point. So yeah, or if I'm like covering anything that like seems a little new, but like as like I'll cover later on in this lecture about paradigm issues, reasonability seems to be something that a lot of debaters like to go for nowadays because like if judges are willing to listen to reasonability, it is probably true that none of these shells, for example, rise to the level of quote unquote potential or like actual abuse that occurred within the round to justify, for example, voting down debaters for like not specifying what type of utilitarianism that they're reading. But like the issue with reasonability as good enough is that it bites into the worst to like the best arguments against reasonability, which is that it's inherently arbitrary, that it is unfair for debaters to bite into it is unfair for debaters to have their like to have, for example, their debates decided on the whims or personal opinions of the judge, for example, because judges should be evaluating what is happening on the flow, for example, and should be evaluating using an offense and defense paradigm. And judges being able to interfere and intersect, for example, and say that X practice isn't abusive enough for them to vote on it is something that is inherently arbitrary, which is unfair for debaters, which makes the debate and the activity fundamentally untenable if judges can just insert their opinions whenever they want, which makes like reasonability good is good enough probably not the best argument. And like many people will just be like, but the 463 times skew, the 463 times skew, everybody, the 2R only has 6 minutes and the 1AR and the 1AR and the 2AR is 7 minutes long. This is not a real argument. Time skew in general, as you will learn throughout this lecture, and something that you will have to learn as well if you're going for theory arguments, like if you're going for like meta theory or like for example drop the argument versus like bad theory arguments, this is not a real argument. Every single debater has 13 minutes. The affirmative has three speeches, but then the negative has longer speeches. Like fundamentally, there is no such thing as like quote unquote a time skew existing within a debate round. it's like nonsensical. But then education is why schools fund debate and theory debates distract from education. This is also not real because one, schools are not really funding debate nowadays, as we are seeing the dying of like institutions within debate and the rising of like private coaching. But secondly, is that also just because education is the reason why schools fund debate, that does not entail why education is something that inherently comes first and doesn't beg the question of like why we do the act of like why debate is an activity that we have like subscribed to and why there are rules within that and why there are rules within that activity. But that will be covered on the fairness portion. But before I move on, are there any questions? I'm not checking the chat, by the way, so like if you have any questions, like unmute.
What warrants would you read for like education?
Like for education, I'll cover this later, but like I think the quote unquote best ones for education are related to things like topic education, which is like the idea of like we only debate the topic for 2 months. For 2 months, and then we have to restart the next, which means that it is valuable, for example, to learn about the topic within that particular time. Or education is the reason why debate is a valuable activity, why we do it over mock trial, over like science Olympiad, etc. Like those are like ones quote unquote for education. But like fairness outweighs will be something that like I'll be explaining later throughout the lecture. And something that like it's something that like another thing that you should think about when you're approaching theory is that you do not have to win education outweighs fairness. It is often better for you to concede that fairness outweighs.
Okay, wait, sorry. I just like have like a follow-up question. So like a better warrant for education is like, oh, like sports are fair or whatever, but we do debate because we like do a lot of research and we learn about like different things and that like
No, yeah, especially if you're approaching this from a critical angle. Another thing that like this lecture is like slightly oriented towards is that this strategy is slightly oriented towards policy and philosophical positions. But like for critical teams that want to go for education outweighs fairness, a good warrant is the idea that like debate is a unique pedagogical space that is like unfound in like other activities and games, which is something like you can't get the educational value from debate from any activity that from any other activity. Like it's fundamentally inseparable. But yeah, any other questions before I move on? All right, awesome. Let me just minimize this actually. Uh, so where does theory come from? So my personal opinion is that theory just came because somebody just wanted to whine about something. Okay, this is not the actual reason for like why theory came about. But like theory basically came about as a practice, as like an argument against as like a certain way to like frame arguments and as a way to like preclude the ability for certain arguments to exist. Like arguably people can argue that topicality gets argued as a theory argument because topicality naturally precludes the ability for affirmatives to read things that aren't, for example, related to the resolution awarding, etc. But like, the idea of like theory as like practice is just the very basic idea is that theory says that X practice in debate is good and should be followed. Something like disclosure theory, where teams should disclose positions that they have read 30 minutes before the round, and that they should open source after the round what positions they have read and then what positions that they went for, or that X practice is bad and shouldn't be done. For example, conditionality. Teams shouldn't run conditional advocacies. Conditional advocacies are bad, and teams should refrain from reading conditional advocacies, inserting warrants. Or teams must defend the resolution, for example, or teams must not, for example, not read non-topical affirmatives, etc. Those are like was like what the basic practice of theory is. And theory claims to establish rules for how our activity functions. They attempt to parametricize what particular content debater they don't necessarily they parametricize what particular win conditions debaters can, for example, use in order to like obtain the ballot. Like conditionality naturally prohibits the ability of teams to run multiple conditional worlds, or process counterpoints bad is like a theory argument that says that process counterpoints are not legitimate opportunity costs or legitimate reasons why the plan is a bad idea. Or for example, like must spec some type of hedonistic must specify what branch of utilitarianism you use. Like those are, for example, like rules that the theory attempts to like attempts to establish for how our activity should function. That teams should, for example, specify what type of branch of utilitarianism they read or that they should disclose. And now, topicality or like plan focus often gets like counted as theory because they set rules on the activity and the role of and like what the role of rejoinder is. And I honestly think that like it's fine to think about topicality and framework as like a theory argument because it is in function of theory argument. Because theory, all it really is just a parametrization on what we are allowed to do in order to win debates. Any questions on theory before we move on, as like a basic concept and where it came from? Nope. All right, awesome. So now let's talk about norm setting versus in-round abuse. There are primarily two ways that we try to conceptualize theory debating in like two types of paradigms: norm setting and then in-round abuse. So norm setting is the most popular version of theory of like how we understand theory debates, particularly on like the East Coast. So the norm setting posits an argument that is that the judge should vote for the best norm that is forwarded within a theory debate. And often this is associated with the paradigm issues known as competing interpretations, rejecting the team, or drop the debater, and then their RVI. The reason for this is that norm setting says that it says that if judges are supposed to determine what is the best norm for the activity to follow, then it only makes sense to compare interpretation. It only makes sense to compare interpretations versus counter interpretations, and it only makes sense to, for the, in that vein, it only makes sense to reject the team or, for example, reward debaters for setting better or worse norms, which is also another justification for the RVI, because the justification for the RVI here is that you should lose for justifying a bad norm within the activity. And another benefit to norm setting as a model of debate is that norm setting says that like interpretations should be interpretations that can be applicable to a whole set of issues across debate. For example, it says like not just in this one particular instance is it good for you to disclose, but in general, as a general practice and as a general rule, it is good for teams to follow by certain community consensuses within the activity, such as disclosing their cases, because disclosure would be a valid norm for the entire activity to follow. In-round abuse is specifically indexed to just evaluating theory debate in the context of what has occurred within the round, and you should only vote if some magical threshold is met. I say magical because I am personally of the opinion that the in-round abuse paradigm and in-round abuse model theory debate is something that is arbitrary, but that will be explained, but that will be explained later. This is often associated with reasonability, as in reasonability is good enough, and that if our norm is good enough, it doesn't matter if their norm is slightly marginally better. You should still not vote against us. It also justifies rejecting the argument or drop the argument instead of rejecting the entire team, because it's a question, for example, of resolving marginal amounts of abuse rather than, for example, rejecting the entire team for something that they something that was done that might have been slightly abusive, but does not skew the entirety of the round. And then in-round abuse is often associated with no RVIs because because the RVI is often associated with the idea that we should forward the best norms for debate, or that debaters should be punished, for example, for reading theory. But in-round abuse fundamentally disagrees with that premise, and that it is not abusive in and of itself to just read a theory shell, which means that like under an in-round abuse paradigm, no RVIs would make the most sense. So paradigm issues such as the RVI and like drop the debate or drop the argument can cross over between both paradigms. There are many people who subscribe to norm setting who believe that rejecting the argument and not the team is like sufficient in order to broadly set norms, because teams can't win on those bad arguments anymore because those arguments aren't legitimate. But those aren't reasons in themselves to vote against those teams, which is why we see a lot of judges nowadays have in their paradigm competing interpretations, no RVIs, and then drop the argument. But then we also have, but then we also have some crossover between, for example, people who think in-round abuse justifies drop the debater because if something was truly abusive within the context of a round, then that would justify rejecting the team in that specific context. And now the thing is, like, reasonability and competing interpretations usually stay within their respective camps because that is what they are fundamentally boiled down to. Competing interpretations ask judges to vote on whether or not a certain norm is better than another norm that the team has counter proposed. And reasonability in a vacuum just ask whether or not a reasonable practice has occurred, or whether a certain threshold has been met in order for judges to not vote for or to vote for theory, which is why reasonability is almost always firmly in the in-round abuse camp and competing interpretations is almost always in the norm setting camp. Does that make sense about the differences between norm setting and in-round abuse as like how we determine models of debate? Any questions before we move on? No questions? Awesome. The next thing is a defense of norm setting. So before everybody panics, norm setting being true does not justify whatever random shells people are reading. This is just a defense of why norm setting is probably a true model of debate and how a true model of debate, but also allows us to conceptualize, for example, why we can read things like meta theory and why, for example, non-resolutional theory is bad, which will be done below. So norm setting is a probably true metric for how we should evaluate theory debates for a couple of key reasons. The first is that magical thresholds are arbitrary and unfair for debaters. This was explained on like why reasonability, good is good enough, is probably a bad argument for many judges, but many judges feel very uncomfortable just voting on reasonability because it feels uncomfortable for them to just insert their respective opinions about whether certain practices are reasonable or whether certain practices are not. And like independently unfair for those debaters because debaters don't know whether some judges think that certain practices are like more fair or less fair than certain others, which means that insofar as that is the case that like we all have different conceptions of what is fair and what is unfair, it would be it would be universally unfair if only the judge, for example, could determine what is unfair and what is fair, and unilaterally, for example, determine with their own decision making that X thing doesn't meet a certain threshold, which is unfair for every single debater involved. The second is that not and the second objection that people often make against norm setting is that not every round will set a new norm. But sure, that might be the case, but that doesn't matter. The idea of norm setting being a true model of debate for how we understand theory debates is not that every single norm is not that every single round is like part of setting a norm within the context of the activity, but rather it's the idea that theoretical arguments and theoretical shells should be about, for example, the entirety of the activity and the implications that it has on the entire activity. You can sort of think about norm setting as like what Amadeus Tell would often say. Shout out to her. Would be would be thinking about theory debate in the context of rule utilitarianism. That like even if certain actions might, for example, be good in some specific instances, they are bad because if they are bad in a general amount, if they were bad as a general rule, then we still ought not to follow. We still ought not to do that bad thing because it's bad as a general rule. So like the idea of norm setting as a theoretical model of debate is that even if certain interpretations might be fair or unfair within one specific round, it is best, for example, to set rules that would be able to apply to the entirety of the activity because those rules are stable and provide stable points for ground. The third idea that almost extends to the third idea, which is that theoretical norms should be consistent over time. If theoretical norms aren't consistent over time, then teams, for example, can shift, for example, what is fair and unfair at a whim, which prevents teams from actually, for example, engaging in the context of like catching, quote unquote, what is actually, quote unquote, abusive, or catching, for example, norms that would like make the activity untenable. So therefore, it is best to just set norms that are tenable for the activity writ large. Now, fairness is an impact, but why? So the issue is that fairness is probably the best impact in many theory debates and topicality debates, but it's often explained very, very poorly. You should never say fairness is an impact because otherwise judges can hack against them. That conflates procedural fairness with structural and like evaluative fairness. You can still evaluate arguments fairly, for example, without, for example, subscribing to every single procedure that upholds our activity. So the idea is that procedural fairness is fundamentally an impact because I don't know how many people here have like watched the lecture that Jasmine Sidham and Nick Lepp gave on T framework, but like if you haven't, please watch that lecture. That lecture was pretty good. Um, is that the idea is that debate is fundamentally a competitive activity. And what does it mean for fairness to be constitutive to that? There are things that fundamentally make debate a game that influence every single thing that we do within the activity. The fact that there must be a winner and a loser. The fact that there are trophies. The fact that there are speaker points. The fact that we have an algorithm that determines, for example, where we are in a certain bracket within elimination rounds. The fact that we go to tournaments so we can qualify to the biggest tournament of the year, either NSDA or the TOC. Those prove that debate is fundamentally constitutive and make it more than just an academic activity where you submit briefs, for example. It is because there's fundamentally an adversary, and that adversary either wins or loses a particular round, which means preserving some level of procedural equity is specifically key when we subscribe to the activity. And we all value the activity for some different reason. Some of us here are critical theorists and want to learn more about the world. Some of us want to have, like, for example, portable skills that translate to better policy decision-making skills, or just better decision-making skills writ large in our everyday lives. Or some of us just want, for example, something fun to do after school, whatever. We all value the activity for for some reason, and sure, those reasons might all be completely different. But fairness begs the question of any possible benefit to the activity whatsoever, because fairness is what undergirds the objective facet of debate. Because while every single benefit of debate is fundamentally subjective and up to every single person, there's only one objective facet of debate, that it is fundamentally a game, and that there is an objective facet of competition, which is why fairness is often associated as an impact. So this is why, for example, a lot of teams misexplain fairness as an impact, but why also fairness is probably more of an impact than education, because unfair debates are probably debates where people and teams don't engage as often. Which means like fairness undergirds, for example, the ability to have those like cool and educational rounds. Any questions on why fairness is an impact and why we should like conceptualize theory debates in the context of like fairness instead of like education? Anybody? Awesome. Next thing I want to talk about. we have gotten to the good stuff. How do we answer bad theory arguments? The first is meta theory, and possibly my favorite argument against theory is that non-resolutional theory is bad. This is probably an argument that you can only read if you are somebody who reads philosophy a lot or somebody who reads policy arguments a lot, because this probably takes out critiques, to be honest. But non-resolution theory is an argument that is becoming popular in policy debate, and now it's becoming popular in LD debate. The fundamental thesis of non-resolutional theory being bad is that shells are unpredictable when they are unmoored from the resolutional wording. So conditionality, for example, conditionality is not something that the resolution talks about, or process counterplans being bad, or picks being bad, or advantage counterplans being bad. All of those arguments are fundamentally arguments that are unmoored from the resolution, or like teams must specify X funding mechanism, or teams must specify what branch of utilitarianism that they use. Those are shells that try to prescribe practices that are not tied to the resolution, which means those shells are fundamentally unpredictable. And those shells are bad to debate because debaters aren't expected, for example, to prove whether or not, for example, they have to like specify X branch of util. Or like whether or not they're allowed to run conditional advocacies, or whether or not they're allowed to run picks, for example, or whether they're allowed to run process counterplans. The only burden that the affirmative has is to prove that a topical plan or that the resolution is a good idea, or the negative needs to naturally disprove that. And any metric that attempts to forcibly remove the ability or parametricize the negative's ability to disprove the resolution or to disprove the affirmative, or vice versa, for the affirmative to prove the resolution or for the affirmative to prove the plan is a good idea, is fundamentally unpredictable and unmoored and arbitrary. And predictability is something that controls the greatest internal link into fairness, because unpredictable debates where one side is prepared because they have decided to prep, for example, the ad hoc norm that they want to propose for the entirety of the activity, versus somebody, for example, who hits the shell random, for example, versus somebody who actually has to debate the shell for the first time. That team who decides to run the unpredictable, who decides to read the unpredictable argument, is naturally going to be more prepared to prove that that argument is a good or that norm is a better idea than the person who has to now defend their norm out of nowhere, which means that predictability controls the internal link for fairness debate for fairness, because the idea of like the 1 and C, for example, being able to read any shell to move 6 minutes on 1 AC offense is the definition of a fairness skew, because at worst the affirmative might make it marginally harder for the negative to negate, for example, certain advocacies, but the negative makes debate fundamentally impossible for the affirmative, or vice versa, because they have justified a norm that is not readily able to be prepared, or would not logically disprove or prove that the plan is a good idea. Which is also why, for example, AF teams should be prepared to debate things like topicality, because topicality arguments come from words from the resolution, and topicality is a fundamental burden of the affirmative and a fundamental stock issue, which means it makes sense for the affirmative to be prepared to debate topicality, but not prepared to defend, for example, whether or not they need to spec what type of hedonistic branch of util exists. And logic is also something that is articulated as an impact, which is also why the RVI is probably a bad argument, because logically it does not make sense, for example, for like teams to win off of something that doesn't meet their burden. If the affirmative has stock issues it has to meet, why does winning a theory argument prove that, for example, it's met its stock issues, it's met its burden to affirm? Why, for example, has a negative, for example, disproven the plan off of just winning some random theory argument? Logically, those do not prove that the app is a good or bad idea. And logic is fundamentally an impact, because like the idea is like, if logic did not exist and we could read illogical arguments, then judges would just vote for whatever they wanted to, and judges don't have jurisdiction, for example, to vote on arguments that patently, for example, are an assault on logic, which is why logic itself is an impact, and why we think that the RVI is bad. So, any questions on like how we think about non-resolution theory bad being like as like a as like a strategy to use against like non-resolutional shells? Any questions on like what this
I have
entails?
a question on like an example. So if a neg team were to read a theory on how the AF didn't give the neg any idea of cost or like time frame, then that's bad. Is that non-resolutional?
Yes, because saying that like app teams must give, for example, the time frame of like XYZ occurring, that is not merged from the resolution. Because like the resolution says the app must defend XYZ, and must defend XYZ thing in order to be topical, in order to meet its burden. That's why topicality is not quote unquote non-resolutional theory, because it literally indexes itself to the resolution. But like this theory argument would obviously be non-resolutional because it doesn't derive itself from the resolution.
Wait, why is must-spec like non-resolutional?
So Muspec, like util, for example, Muspec util is definitely non-resolutional because there's nothing in the resolution that says, for example, that teams must specify what branch of utilitarianism says. Now, Muspec X mechanism within the topic, That is something that is up for debate. I'm of the personal opinion that must spec X mechanism within the resolution is still non-resolutional because even if it derives words from the resolution, that doesn't make it resolutional theory. Because resolutional theory, because like the idea of resolutional theory is that is about theory that prescribes the resolution as the enforcement and the parametrization of affirmative and negative ground, which means that topicality, for example, or plan focus is legitimate because it says because they derive their authority and the authority to parametrize what is legitimate ground for the affirmative and negative based off of the words of the resolution, and they parametricize that ground based on the resolution. But must spec, for example, funny like must spec, for example, what becoming a party to UNCLOS means or becoming a party to the Rome Statute means. Like those, for example, would not be considered resolutional theory because those shells, even if they derive their words from the resolution, they don't derive their authority to enforce or parametricize certain practices or ground based off the resolution, which makes them inherently non-resolutional and still unpredictable. But there's also another list of reasons why spec shells are bad independent of like them being non-resolutional. Any questions? Any more questions before we move on to like some common objections that I often see against non-resolutional theory? Let me open the chat now. All right, awesome. So common objections. But what if somebody is racist? Okay, this objection often exists. So if somebody is like actually, for example, racist, tab exists and equity officers exist. Admittedly, tab sucks, but like also it is probably bad for judges to have to try to adjudicate whether or not somebody was racist, for example. Like IVIs are obviously an example of like non-resolutional theory, but it's probably bad for judges, for example, to make decisions based off of, for example, to make judges on like on words, for example, like accessibility or is an entire rant I have about this, but like terms, just for example, such as accessibility, violence, etc., have very precise definitions within the context of tournaments and within the context of like legal academia, which means that it's probably bad, for example, for judges to insert their opinions about whether or not somebody in the round was racist, and it's often best left for tab rooms to resolve. And if somebody was genuinely racist, for example, like they said the N-word, for example, that should not be debated out. That is a reason to stop the round and go to tab room. But then so like if somebody is actually racist, for example, racism should never be a theory argument. It should always be an argument that's either used as like a justification for a different argument on the flow, or it should be something that is escalated to the tap room. Because judges, often 18, 19-year-olds like me, should not be determining whether or not a student is racist. But then the other objection, but disclosure. So the thing about disclosure often is that tournament rules and community consensus solves. Many tournaments require and mandate that teams, for example, disclose at least, for example, citations on the wiki. But also is that community consensus solves is that even, for example, in college policy, where literally nobody reads disclosure theory, teams still properly disclose because it's a good community consensus and a good community norm for the entirety of the activity to revolve around. But also like if tournament rules, for example, mandate that people disclose anyways, then that is also a legitimate theory argument because it enforces tournament rules. But if disclosure is still, but even though disclosure might be a good norm in a vacuum, it's still bad and worse, for example, to say that like teams should be allowed to read not all non-resolutional shells of all types. This goes back to like the argument for norm setting and that how norms should be something that is consistent over time and that even if there are some shells that might be good in a vacuum, that does not justify the practice of reading non-resolutional theory for the entirety of the entire season. And then the most common objection, but infinite 10 condo, something abusive practices, reading word picks, etc. First is that infinite condo is probably good anyways, but second, and also this would probably massively backfire for the negative because reading 10 conditional advocacies means that like they would never be able to develop themselves properly, to develop those positions properly. I'll like send like more like resources for like non-resolutional theory. I don't know how many of y'all have like read victory briefs articles, but like VBI articles are like genuinely really amazing about this. But the idea is that the resolution as like as a stasis point for ground, tournament rules, community consensus, and then also just like strategy prevents quote unquote massive abuse from occurring within those debates, and practices that might seem abusive, for example, are actually extremely easy to exploit. And those practices are generally pretty easy to exploit as like a general concept, which means like there's no reason, for example, why we have to turn every single argument that might about some sketchy practice into a theory shell. But what is worse, for example, for the activity is for us to have different conceptions of what is unfair and what is fair, when the only thing that is common for every single person is tournament rules and the resolution. as a stasis point for ground, and it is bad for us to try to determine what is bad. For example, what is a bad or good norm off of post hoc rules for that people, for example, are unprepared to debate about, and that is a untenable and terrible model for how we should think about, for example, what norms are good for our activity to set. So, any questions about non-resolution theory and like the common objections we have to it? Questions, concerns? Awesome. So the next thing before I'll move on to the next slide is like just meta theory writ large. So I didn't create a slide for this, but meta theory. So if you guys are unfamiliar, meta theory is basically a theoretical argument about theory. It basically sets a norm on what theoretical arguments are legitimate. So oftentimes a lot of teams will read meta theory against shells and like say for example if the affirmative reads for example AFC in the one it reads AFC randomly in the 1AR. A common tune on meta theory shell is like is that app teams if they want to read AFC must read it in the 1AC. And like I think meta theory is a very good way to leverage against bad theory arguments because it is often true that that certain bad theory arguments they also endorse bad norms for theoretical debates for theoretical debates writ large. So it is often good to punish those teams by reading like good meta theory arguments by reading meta theory arguments that indict, for example, the practice of whatever theoretical norm that they are upholding. For example, if they read shells, for example, like for example, reading disclosure in the 1AR instead of like reading disclosure in the 1AC. Like let's say, for example, the negative didn't properly disclose like something on their wiki, and like the app decides to wait to read disclosure into the 1AR. A common tune in our meta theory shell is must read disclosure in the 1AC because it is bad, for example, for teams to sandbag theoretical arguments all the way into the 1AR when you can read a violation in the 1AC. So like that's how like you can punish teams that like decide to like sandbag. If you think like for example a theory argument is like sandbagged into the very end and you are a confident theory debater, it is often smart to read meta theory in the 2 and like the 2 and R as like a reason for why they don't get to read like sandbag their best arguments all the way into like the last portion of the debate. Like this is like a very like scuffed lecture about meta theory, but like any questions of like how meta theory works and like how we can deploy meta theory versus like questionable practices in debates.
Yeah, I have a couple.
What's up?
First, like for meta theory, would you think it's smart, like if there's if you're in the 2NR and then in the 1AR there was like, I don't know, like circuit debater theory or something like that.
Mm.
Just kind of something dumb that they could have read in the 1AC. Like, would you read like A, no non-res theory, and then B, read like, oh, like interpretation must read out of round violations in the 1AC. And then like the standards would be like what, like time skew, strat skew, like if they wanted to prevent the abuse, they would have read it earlier, so we would have more time to talk about it. Like, what would the standards be?
Yeah, those standards sound pretty good. In terms of like what I would do in the 2 and R, I personally was like somebody who like was not very confident in theory debating a lot of the time. So like I would just go for non-res theory bad and then just answer the shell upfront. But like if you are a confident theory debater, then you might, for example, decide to not read non-res theory bad and you might decide to just read the meta theory shell yourself. Because if you read non-resolutional theory, there's like some common objections to non-resolution theory bad. I just remembered. The first objection is that non-resolutional theory bad is non-resolutional theory. That argument is false because non-resolutional theory bad is not a theoretical argument. It is a substantive argument that points out that non-resolutional theory does not prove that the app is a good or bad idea, which means that it is not something that a judge can jurisdictionally vote on. The second thing is that if you read non-res theory bad and then like you decide to read a non-res shell yourself, the True for example, can get a good ethos moment in which they can just say that like they also engage in the practice of not reading non-resolutional shells, which proves that it is still good in some instances to check certain practices of abuse. So like time-wise, for example, it takes a while, for example, to develop a good non-resolutional theory bad block, but it also takes time, for example, for you to read a meta theory shell and then also answer the 1AR shell to begin with. So you're often better picking off whether or not you want to like have a tuner that is very deflationary, that wants to deflate the situation and wants to just go for substance, or whether or not you want a tuner that wants to like punish bad 1ARs and go for like meta theory in the tuner and still go for substance at the same time, which puts the 2AR in a really bad position. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so like you would either go like, oh, non-resolutional theory bad warrants, or you would read like interpretation out of round violations must be in the 1AC and then just hammer them on case.
Yeah. Oh, like just hammer them on the shell, and then like for example, just go for like then like for the rest of the speech of the true and R, go for what you would have gone for anyways. Like no matter if you're a negative and you're in the true and R, you still obviously go for substance. No matter if you decide to go for non-res theory bad or you decide to go for a meta theory shell, you just want to decide: do I want to like deflate the situation and like I don't want the true to go for the shell, or am I confident that if the true goes for the shell, that the true is going to lose, and I think I can beat them on the true and R shell? Like that's the situation that you have to put yourself in.
Got you. Like, do you think that you can win like meta theory above their shell and answer the shell proper, or would you rather just like answer shell proper, come up with like objection to the shell, and then go for everything else?
Yeah, exactly. Awesome. Anybody else have any questions before we move on to reasonability? Awesome. All right, reasonability. I said that we would come back to reasonability. I don't think reasonability get like what's it called is articulated properly in LDDB because I think reasonability is a good argument and can be offense under a norm setting model. So you should read reasonability not as a counter standard for not as like a counter argument versus like competing interpretations. You should instead read reasonability or topic education as a standard for your counter interpretation. The idea that is that you should weigh the lost opportunity cost of theory debate of like having to debate, for example, theory versus the potential topic education that is still guarded under the world of the counter interpretation, and it should be contextualized to the practice of the counter interpretation defense, which means like the way that you want to think about reasonability is my practice in this specific instance like good enough, for example, not to trigger abuse, but rather is the trade-off, for example, of us not debating the topic and instead of, for example, just debating theoretical norms and just debating theoretical norms for the entirety of the year, is that something that is more valuable than like our counter interpretation, which could theoretically sustain valuable and sustainable debates? Like reasonability says, like our counter interpretation sustains good debates about the topic, and that focusing on arguments that naturally crowd out substantive arguments, such as theory, leads to debates where we are not talking about the topic at hand, which is bad because we only have 2 months to talk about the topic. Like that is how you want to contextualize reasonability as offense under norm setting. So when you're weighing for example, when you're weighing reasonability as offense under norm setting, the idea is that you want to explain reasonability as something an intervention as something that is inevitable because it is true to some degree intervention is inevitable. It's just bad when judges unilaterally intervene and decide whether a practice is good or good enough. The idea is that weighing is something that we all do when we're weighing, for example, impacts on critiques, counterpoints, disads, etc. Which means that like weighing, for example, the lost opportunity cost of us not debating the topic versus, for example, the potential for our counter interpretation to lead to bad debates for the rest of the year is something that like judges do anyways when we decide to have weighing debates. Which is why reasonability as offense under our versus under a norm setting model and under competing interpretations is something that is like fundamentally still valuable to like have and something that is like not inherently bad for judges to do. And now the question is like, why does topic education matter? Truthfully, I don't really see an impact to topic education because like if you want to learn about the topic, just read a book. But like I guess like the best articulation for topic education mattering is like debate in the context of debate is that debate is a valuable space because debate is the only space where you have to rigorously test those arguments against others and then debate against other people, which naturally refines your argument through constant clash with other individuals. So the idea is like if topic education is something that inherently matters, is it better for us to have theory debates or is it better for us to just presume that the world of the counter interpretation is something that still sustains those topical debates that preserve topic education? Does that make sense as like a brief like roadmap of like how we think about reasonability as offense under norm setting? Any questions before we move on to the last thing, which is just being a shell head on? Awesome. So now we'll get over to just answering the shell. Some standards are just not warrants. Philosophical education, novice inclusion, strat skew. These are not impacts for the most part. Philosophical education is one, not unique to LD anymore because policy debaters are reading philosophical positions now. So I guess that standard is bye bye. But like, there's no inherent reason why philosophical education matters because like one is that debaters like are terrible when they talk about philosophy. Like it becomes very very apparently clear when debaters are growing older that they have no idea what on earth Hegel, Kant, or Hobbes says. Like, I'm also really guilty. I am still somebody who has no idea what the hell Hegel says, despite like reading Hegel in debate. But The idea is that philosophical education is like these standards, for example, novice inclusion. Novice inclusion is like also a questionable standard because in open varsity debate, like if you're debating on like, for example, a varsity circuit, it makes it unclear as to why, for example, varsity debaters have to like naturally adapt their arguments in like a world where like debaters are expected to debate at their best. Like that doesn't make sense. And Stratsky as an argument doesn't really make sense because like every single strategy is naturally meant to like skew to some degree. Like we obviously all want to win, and we all obviously want to have the ability to like advance further within the tournament, which means that we naturally develop strategies that are naturally harder to debate. So why is strat skew like an impact? Like all of these standards, for example, these are genuinely not warrants for the most part. Like the only warrants that seem to matter, that seem to like actually have like impacts are like predictability because those are like indexed to like the resolution and indexed to whether or not we are able to engage within the first place because the resolution sets a stable point for ground. So like that's why, for example, you never see the word strat skew as like a standard for like topicality. You have limits and then you have predictability and then you occasionally have ground. And like a lot of these arguments just boil down to debate is so hard for me, so therefore I should be able to not have to answer my opponent's framework. My opponent must concede my framework because it's simply too hard for me to extend my framework and extend my offense at the same time and then count and then answer my opponent's framework. Wah wah wah. So what? Yeah, of course debate is like hard. Like that's the whole point of the activity, that it is hard to win and that you should be forced to do well and that you should be forced to defend your position from multiple angles if you expect to win. So like saying that like it is hard. So like this is where it comes back to like theory debate is inherently a lot of whining because it essentially says that like certain practices that would otherwise be able to win absent this theoretical norm that parametricizes certain content away is something that is like good or valuable for the activity. So like obviously, for example, some forms of whining are justified. Like whining in the context of like topicality. Yeah, that's fine because like the resolution is like the only stasis point for ground. So like obviously apps should probably be topical. But that's not like another conversation. But that's another conversation. But like debate being hard, so therefore the app must specify what branch of util they use. Or debate is hard, so therefore the negative must not contest the app framework. Or debate is hard, so therefore the negative cannot read conditional adequacies. Like what? No. That sounds arbitrary and sounds like a way and it just sounds like a bunch of whining because and just sounds like a bunch of whining. Like X practice is hard to debate. So what? Like X practice is hard to debate. Is it because you're bad at debate or is it because it strays away from like the resolutional wording? Like just because X practice, for example, is like there like it is fundamentally true. Some strategies are indeed harder to debate. For example, like me, for example, reading three disads in a counterplan, for example, is probably harder than like somebody reading, for example, like a one disad and then not contesting the case. Like obviously some strategies are harder to debate than the others, but that is a terrible metric to determine whether or not some practice, whether or not that person should expect to lose to theory, or whether or not that practice should be prohibited. Because if it's topical, so what? If it disproves the app being a good idea, so what? Like that is fundamentally the purpose of debate is to win, which naturally means that some arguments are naturally going to be harder to debate because some arguments are naturally going to be more true than others, are naturally going to be more robustly academically supported than others, etc. Like fairness cues are something that are inevitable, or in like in strategy cues are something that are inevitable within debate, but it does not justify us having those having, for example, norms that come out of nowhere, which is like another justification for why we should think that non-resolutional theory is bad, but also why it's like also a good hypercharge for like arbitrariness as a standard. I think arbitrariness is like a standard that is not used often enough in counter-interpretation debates because it is often true that most interpretations are inherently arbitrary and they are derived from nowhere. So like teams who are responding to theory should cry wolf, for example, and say that like these shells are inherently arbitrary to debate, and that any practice that allows us to like prove that the app is a good or bad idea should be something that is fair game. And then like there's like other like random shells, for example, like must not read two standards or must not like or else it leads to double turning. No, there are many ways, for example, like quote unquote abusive practices can just be solved by for example, if somebody reads two frameworks, that's a reason to concede one framework. That's a reason to concede one framework and then straight turn that framework and read contention offense under that framework. Because once you have conceded something is true, that means that like that thing is now is definitively true now in the context of that debate round, and you can read offense under that. That's why, for example, like there's like no theory argument that says must not read link turns and impact turns because it's hard to answer both. Bro, just like answer either the link turn or just answer the impact or like just like concede the link turn and concede the impact turn and boom, they double turn themselves. Like what do you like that's like a thing is that like these like if you break down what these theory interpretations ask debaters to do and then you just break them down to like what those scenarios actually look like, it becomes very apparent that that doesn't make any coherent sense, and that's not how debate actually works. But my 1 AR is only 4 minutes. That sounds like a reason why you should do speed drills, or that sounds like a reason why you should like get that sounds like a reason why you should do speed drills or efficiency drills, but that does not sound like a reason why the negative should lose because it decided to read a bunch of arguments that, for example, disprove that the plan is a good idea. But the whole idea is that if you're answering theory and you're answering the shell, like okay, don't say this in an actual debate round because it probably does not sound the best at times. But like boils down to like telling theory teams to just stop whining and to like actually get good at debating. Like theory debate fundamentally has boiled down to teams don't want to debate the resolution anymore. They don't want to they like it's not even a question of like teams like it's just a question of like teams aren't willing to like debate critiques anymore. Teams don't like answering counterpoints anymore. Teams are like scared of like having to answer like reasons why the app is a bad idea. So and teams are like bad at defending like for example whatever like framework they came up with against utilitarianism. So like instead of like for example actually debating, teams have resorted now to theory debating, to like for example try to parametricize certain content away. For example, like theory against critiques, theory against process counterpoints, theory against this ads even nowadays, like intrinsic tests. Like the idea is like just stop whining and get good at like the idea is like if you're ever going against theoretical arguments, the idea is just stop whining and get good at debate. Any questions before I move on to like our last section, which is like the brief section I have about how to like theory debate when you're having a critique. Questions? All right, cool. All right, the last thing I'll do before I like have like a live like demonstration, before I like have like a live for example like analysis of like a theory argument I've seen nowadays is like how to theory debate with critiques in mind. So if you are reading a critique, you often don't have a lot of these tools. Like you can still use reasonability, you can still answer the shell, but you can't like, for example, go for like non-resolutional theory bad because like you have read an argument that isn't indexed to the resolution to begin with. So like what can you do in that context? If you're, for example, reading a critique, you can often leverage, for example, framework, like for example, like your rolled about against theory. Because if your rolled about says like offense must be indexed to a particular set of practices or must be indexed, for example, to proving XYZ thing, then that means, for example, theory logically does not operate under that rule of the ballot. And the rule of the ballot naturally takes out theory because the rule of the ballot parametricizes what content would be considered legitimate. So therefore the rule of the ballot and theory are fundamentally on the same level because they're both arguments of parametricized content, but you winning the role of the ballot proves, for example, that like certain practices should be allowed, and those are logical practices that should be allowed and should be something that should be debated, and that any attempt to like limit that would be something that is inherently arbitrary and self-serving, which means that like saying, for example, that the role of the ballot takes out theory is a valid argument that K teams should nowadays go more. Does anybody have like any questions about actually about K debating versus theory that they want to like go over before I move on to like a quick demonstration of like a shell I've seen pretty often? No questions? Awesome. Let me stop sharing my screen right here. Then let me, what's it called? Move over to, let me share my screen for a different tab. All right. Can everybody see my Word doc? Me. Can everybody see my Word doc? All right. Awesome. So specutil. Specutil is often an argument that people seem to have to run into a day. So there's like different ways that like you want to so like the first thing that you want to do versus like shells like this is like can you reasonably go for like non-resolutional theory bad? If you're reading a phil or policy absolutely 100% you can go for non-res theory bad. Like that is something that like you should be prepared to like go for. And some things right here is like the and then like the idea of like for example just beating back a shell is just like weighing your standards against their standards because like debates never really come down to fairness versus education as much as debaters try to think that they do because like the thing is like oftentimes one fairness probably does outweigh education because education can be garnered in some other contexts but secondly is that like standards have internal links often into both. Like shiftiness, for example, that has an internal link into education. Strat skew, that has an internal link into education. Resolvability, that has an internal link into education, but it also has an internal link into fairness. Because irresolvable debates, they're unfair for because nobody is able to like resolve whether or not something has occurred. But they're also like bad because but they're also bad for education because if debates are irresolvable and you can't weigh between certain metrics and certain standards, then obviously we can't learn anything about that. So the idea is that like how would like for example like somebody here want to answer like the shiftiness standard here. Anybody feel free to like unmute and then we can go over like common responses versus the shell.
Can I could try, I guess.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, like firstly, like most util apps will read extinction outweighs. So like no, you can't shift into like extinction good if you've already read extinction outweighs. The framework arguments that you do read in the like the frame sorry, wait, would this be like a 1AR shell or a
One in C shell usually. This is usually a one
one
in
and
C.
C? Okay, that's what I thought. Okay. The AC framework arguments will like imply what is considered moral, and so will the advantages under them. So like if you make turns like oh death good under util or like you shift into rule utilitarianism, that probably takes out a ton of your offense as well, which means you can't be shifty insofar as your framing has to completely fit all of the advantages you read.
No, yeah, those are like just good intuitive responses. Like that takes out shiftiness and strat skew like pretty easily because like yeah, certain strategy like yeah, like you can't like re magically restart by reading Death Good in like the 1AR. Like the 1 and C can actually pinpoint, for example, what positions would naturally be like offense under like their util framework, just like what the 1EC has already said. And like this resolvability argument, like resolvability like the best answer against like resolvability writ large is just like no debate around it has ever been irresolvable because somebody didn't include some specific weighing mechanism. Because weighing mechanisms come later within debate rounds anyways. That's like just how naturally debate operates. But secondly is that like even if like is that like there's no example of like a debate being irresolvable. Like unless somebody can like point to like a debate round in like 2013 that has been like not resolvable, then like this argument doesn't really hold much different weight. Because like sure, like there might be infinite amounts of like, for example, what is like considered hedonistic and like what and different types of those of hedonisms, but then the idea is like they all boil down to determining whether something might be good. They all have a common understanding that like that some things are good and some things are bad, even though like they disagree on like the very specifics. Those don't make debates inherently irresolvable. So like there's no reason why like for example like not specifying like what branch of hedonistic utility we use is like inherently irresolvable. Like this is like when we're just like when you're like going against just random shells, it's just like making smart intuitive arguments that and putting defense to their standards while also having offense of your own. Like either non-resolution theory being bad, like an arbitrariness standard. Because like it's hard, for example, to like generate offense against spec shells. It's hard to generate offense against spec shells besides reject spec shells because they're infinitely aggressive or like reject non-resolution theory because it's infinitely aggressive. Because like spec shells, for example, it's hard to like outside of those two arguments, it's hard to like generate offense off against spec shells. So just like putting smart defense to their standards while also having like offense like arbitrariness or like reasonability as offense under your account under your interpretation is something that like should be used more often. And like and then like just like another thing about like spec shells is like I think spec shells are like incredibly vulnerable to like what's called meta theory because like you can read a meta theory argument yourself. Interpretation debaters must not read spec shells. And then you just need to win the spec shells a bit large bad. And then boom. Like that's how like how you could potentially approach like how to answer like certain shells. In particular spec shells, because spec shells are becoming more and more like are becoming more and more popular as like time goes on. And if you're confident winning spec shells are bad and you're confident of being a good theory debater, then maybe you want to take them up on the meta theory approach. And maybe you want, for example, to like try to like stake the round on theory. But if not, you have plenty of tools, for example, such as going for arbitrariness, answering the shell upright, or going for reasonability or non-resolutional theory bad as like optimal strategies. Let's see. Let me stop sharing my screen now. Does anybody have any questions that they want to like just talk about theory before I stop the recording?
I would like I have a general question about like the category of like stupid shells that are like out of round violations or like wiki violations or like for like doc formatting or like must name every judge in the panel. Like, is there like a general argument? Would you just go for like no out of round violations against that?
I think out of round violations bad is a good argument. I think that going for non-resolution theory is always a good argument. But I think like the general checklist applies. Reasonability, arbitrariness, non-resolution theory bad always applies to like these like random arguments about like you must format certain documents that way. That's one arbitrary, but also like that restricts certain debaters from like being able to like format their wikis in particular ways, which is bad because debaters should have free reign to like make their wikis look however they want to, so long as it's still navigatable. Like you can still like leverage plenty of like what you can still leverage, for example, the same common arguments that you would make against normal super shells versus like these out of round super shells, while also having like out of round violations bad. Because like it is probably true, out of round violations outside of maybe disclosure are bad. like another good argument that you can potentially make about out of round violations is that you must email, for example, about out of round violations. For example, like if you have a problem, for example, with like how a wiki is formatted or like evidence ethics, for example, you should probably email that team about that. And like because like the idea is like turning, for example, bad wiki practices or like bad evidence, for example, into a case snake or like into a debate strategy is worse for the integrity of the activity than like for example bad wikis, because bad wikis, for example, those could be unintentional. Like sometimes teams forget to do something, and like teams should make good conscious and good faith efforts for the sake of the activity to make their wikis look good. But then turning that like instance of like of the person not like for example making their wiki look good without informing them, and then turning that into a debate strategy against them is worse for the integrity of the activity, because it takes out our ability, for example, to just debate in general, to just debate about the topic or just like debate about something that isn't disclosure every single round. Yeah, no worries. Any other questions?
Can you explain reasonability a little more?
Yeah,
Loki
sure.
missed that part.
You're good. So like the way that like let me start sharing my screen again for like the slideshow. If I can find it. I can't.
Got kicked out, but because I accidentally closed my computer.
You're good. You're good. Let me find like what's it called? The slideshow. I can't find the slideshow actually. If anybody has any questions, just like feel free to like what's it called? Email to like just email. Let's see here. Present, share. There we go. Super theory is stupid. All right. Hold up. Let me. So reasonability. The way that you should wait. Why does bruh, seriously? Okay. All right, reasonability. So the way that you want to think about the way that you want to think about reasonability is you want to think about reasonability as offense under a norm setting. So instead of like saying that reasonability is good enough, you shouldn't say that reasonability is about whether or not our counterinterpretation is able to sustain good topical debates that preserve topic education for the entirety of the year. If our counterinterpretation does that, then you should vote or then you should not vote for theory, because it trades off with the ability to actively debate against to debate about the topic, because theory naturally crowds out substance, because it crowds out our ability to engage about the topic. And that is offense under us because things like topic education matter. Does that make sense for like why reasonability is offense? Or do you still have
Wait, can you
questions?
explain it again?
Yeah. So like reasonability is offense under a norm setting if you articulate it as such, because it instead of like saying our practice is good enough, it says that our practice sustains a good model of debate for an entire year, which preserves topic education. And that is better than, for example, us having constant theory debates about something that is completely not about the resolution, which prevents us from actually talking about things that matter, substance, because theory is naturally something that crowds out substance.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Like just like weigh the way that you want to do it is that you want to weigh offense under reasonability as like under competing interpretations, and reasonability as a standard against like whatever quote unquote norm that they think that, for example, that the other opponent is setting. And like this can't and then the way you want to answer like the judge intervention DA is just like weighing is something that we all do anyway. So it's not intervention in this regards. Like it is bad if judges like unilaterally insert if something is like reasonable or not reasonable. But it's not bad when judges are just like weighing that, for example, versus like a potential norm that might occur. Let's see here. Any other questions before I stop the recording?
So basically, this is like a general like question just for clarification. So theory is like on the rules, general rules of debate. Like theory, what I've like been taught is that theory is on the general rules of debate. So the non-resolutional theory is like things that don't so things like time frame, like stuff that you say, but like it doesn't really like saying that doesn't really like affect the whole debate or something like that, right?
It's not like that. It's like the way you want to think about theory is like theory attempts to set rules for the activity. It attempts to parametricize some forms of content as legitimate and some forms of content that are not. It attempts to like set the division of like what af in a ground looks like. And then non-resolutional theory is our theory arguments that attempt to set rules that don't have the authority of the resolution to back them. Like spec hedonistic util. Like spec hedonistic util doesn't have the authority, for example, of the resolution to try to set a rule on what content is like allowed and what offense is allowed.
makes
Does that make sense
makes
for like
sense.
how we should
Yeah.
conceptualize theory?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Any other questions before I stop the recording?